an input from the United States of America. The government of the United States has nominated Colonel James O. Robinson, Jr., who is the Assistant Chief of Staff, G5 for Security of Cooperation, Strategy, Plans and Policy at the headquarters United States Army Pacific in Hawaii, to represent the government of the United States and deliver his remarks. Colonel James Robinson is currently assigned as the Assistant Chief of Staff, G5 Security Cooperation Strategy, Plans and Policy Division at the headquarters of the United States Army Pacific. Colonel Robinson received his commission through Davidson College in Political Science and Law Studies in 1987, Masters of Art in Western European Studies from Monterrey Institute of International Studies in 1997, and Colonel Robinson also holds a Master of Science in Global Leadership from the University of California, San Diego in year 2005. He is a graduate of Indonesia's prestigious Senior Service College in 2006 and the United States Army War College in 2012, where he earned a Master's in Strategic Studies. He is a classmate of several Sri Lankan Army officers present here today, and he is very proud of that fact. Colonel Robinson remains proficient in 4 languages: Indonesian, German, Spanish, and French. And I have earnestly requested him to speak in English today. He served his basic branch command and staff assignments in air defense artillery units with 3rd Armored, 101st Airborne, and 10th Mountain Divisions in peacekeeping, operational, and combat tours. As a commander and Foreign Asia area officer, he served Special Operations Joint Interagency, United Nations and Embassy tours in Europe, North Africa, and Middle East, and also in the Asia Pacific. Colonel Robinson is the principal author of the United States Army Strategy for Army Relations in the Pacific, published in April 2012. And it is entitled Partnering in the Pacific Theater, Assuring Security and Stability Through Strong Army Partnerships. And that is exactly what he is going to share with us today. Over to you, Colonel Robinson.
Honorable Ministers, Secretary of His Excellency President, Commander of the Sri Lankan Army, other commanders and chiefs of staff of Sri Lankan, Brunei, Maldives, Army, Navy, and Air Force, honorable professors who spoke today, distinguished panelists and guests, other senior officers, and after 3 days, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of Lieutenant General Francis J. Wasinski, the commander of U.S. Army Forces Pacific, I thank you for this opportunity to address this forum today and share some of the United States Army's experiences over the past decade in conflict and post-conflict phases of operations, and offer some thoughts as they may be relevant to our discussions. Before I make my formal remarks, I am in full agreement with Dr. Swami's earlier comments. I would like to thank the Sri Lankan Army, the Ministry of Defense, the Sri Lankan people for an absolutely thoughtful, welcoming, and well-organized forum. In appreciation, please join with me in a round of applause. Well, one can easily notice from the earlier introductions, I'm a few stars light and a few years junior to my esteemed colleagues that have spoke to you this week. But nonetheless, it is an honor to speak to you today on planning for future reconciliation in the context of preparing for the operational environment. I will use lessons learned from the U.S. Army and our efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and leave with you 6 key points. One might ask, why would someone stationed in the Asia Pacific offer lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan? Over the past 10 years, forces from U.S. Army Pacific have served in Iraq and Afghanistan and continue to serve there, over 15,000. We expect to be there until 2014, and on a daily basis, we register losses as, weekly basis. We are aware of the lessons hitting home as we continue to operate there. As members of this region, we consider these lessons learned to improve the conduct of our engagement throughout the Asia Pacific. While no two situations are alike between countries or within countries, Sir Bill Jeffries made that point yesterday, it is through rigorous analysis of all situations that enriches our knowledge and ability as service members to plan, be accountable, and act more efficiently in the future. As professionals at the tip of the spear of our countries, we must always be critical of ourselves, introspective, and accountable. We cannot afford not to. As Major General Stone commented yesterday, this is part of warfighting. We must adapt our strategies and tactics to achieve optimal results. And that is the goal of my speech today. While the U.S. Army is quite adept in conducting combat, we have grappled with post-conflict phases of operations over the most recent decade. There are many variables that factor into combat. The strategies of post-conflict introduces vastly more complex environment for land forces largely trained to close with and destroy the enemy. Our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan have shown that in some cases there may be no clear delineation between combat, post-conflict phases, and where many units who are in combat are providing civilian support to civilian agencies and also enhancing civil capacity near simultaneously. Military operations often take place around and amongst civilian populations who must be protected and provided for, even as we fight enemy forces. Protecting the population includes not only complying with the law of armed conflict, it also consistently requires us to respect human rights and basic dignities of those populations we serve. This is my key point number one. Failure to treat civilians with respect risks alienating populations and reanimating old and perhaps exacerbating new grievances. That can give rise to renewed conflict. This is a lesson that we have learned in our engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq. Protecting and providing for civilian populations is also a mission the Army cannot do alone, as many of the skills and expertise required to effectively govern civilian populations reside outside of the Army in large quantities. The need to engage legitimate authorities as early as possible is very important, and that's my key point number two. In our experiences, the engagement of legitimate civilian authorities includes working with civilian authorities both within our own government and, more importantly, outside of it, and with local experts. In Iraq, we found that though civil infrastructure had existed, it was in shambles due to years of conflict, corruption, and sanctions. In Afghanistan, we found almost no infrastructure at all, which brought even more serious challenges that over 10 years of involvement there, we have just begun to address. In Iraq, we were able to bring in expertise and investment that provided a catalyst for the Iraqis to begin to find solutions of their own. We began by searching for expertise from within our government to advise and assist Iraqi authorities in almost all aspects of administration and government. This included expertise in water, sewage, power, the legal system, and healthcare. The post-conflict goal to enable capacity of Iraqi authorities in administering their own provinces and government has largely been accomplished. But of course, mistakes were made early, and there remains gaps in what we are able to provide and do. In Afghanistan, we have largely been working to help cultivate effective government authorities and services that never existed, especially at the national levels. This puts a particular strain on the civilian populations who are vulnerable not only to warring parties, but as a result of the lack of governance. Through these challenges, we built a core of U.S. civilian experts who are now well placed to respond to other contingencies. We also greatly enhanced our coordination within our own government agencies, especially between the Departments of State and the Departments of Defense. Secretary Clinton and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates spoke jointly on several occasions on the need to more fully integrate our diplomatic, our developmental, and our national defense efforts. Government agencies simply must work in concert to achieve maximum effectiveness, especially in situations where resources are limited. Security of the civilian experts and the population they serve is a priority as well. This is point number 3. Our troops became de facto authorities in many cases and had to perform duties that they had little preparation in and experience with, especially during the initial stages of conflict. However, even when U.S. troops were primary authority, our goal was always to seek ways to bolster the civilian authorities, which in Iraq often involved a complex mixture of political representation and tribal leadership. It can be said that many times we were also fighting against elements within these very same tribal, ethnic, and political groups. Eventually, with much effort, we reached a point where Iraqi tribal leaders largely calculated that it was better to begin to work with the U.S. rather than totally against. We understood the use of force should always be the last resort. Although the presence of force can enable political discussion, the dialogue must eventually move past the need, the presence, and use of force. This brings up an interesting facet of the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan by the importance of building capacity of local security forces. In the U.S., we do not have a national police force, so we do not have that experience to draw on. We do, however, have some experience in building capacity of militaries. And from that history, we draw from the experience also from our coalition partners who have national police forces. We undertook a massive effort in Iraq to train the Iraqi army and police force, and a similar one underway today in Afghanistan. We recognize the necessity of building the capacity of police forces. As we assess, the police should be the frontline force providing security and civil order to the local populations, which is my point number 4. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we sent teams of advisors to build the capacity of local police forces. These teams were modeled after special forces teams, but sourced or drawn from the conventional army. They lived with their host nation police force, work alongside, and train together. With few exceptions, the U.S. Army reinforced principles of human rights, led by example, and made clear the respect for human rights is a critical element to effective policing. Building security forces is a complex task that includes material, personnel resourcing, not to mention building the trust and confidence of local populations. The most effective way of achieving this is providing a competent and well-trained force that is seen as fair and impartial. One example of the difficulties in achieving this comes from the Iraqi province of Kirkuk, where the Arab and Kurdish populations converge, not to mention a sizable minority of ethnic Turkmen. Kirkuk, as you know, is an oil-rich province that is highly coveted by the Kurdish population and the central government that is Arab dominated. The police force in Kirkuk consists mostly of Kurds, and the central government stationed military forces, or army forces there, they are primarily Arab. However, both forces undertook efforts to diversify in 2009, with the Army Division appointing a Kurdish assistant commander and several units of Kurdish soldiers. Likewise, the police recruited Arabs and Turkmens. The Army and police began to conduct joint checkpoints and patrols, sometimes with U.S. forces, but today primarily on their own. A key initial challenge in these efforts was the language barrier, and we've heard about that several times. But through genuine collegial efforts and deliberate language programs, they overcame these challenges. The result was a more unified effort, enhanced communications, which led to mission success and a better understanding of cultures and peoples. Ultimately, this served to show the population that the Army and the police were concerned with the security of the citizens of Kirkuk, not solely interested in looking after the interests and primary interests of the central government in Baghdad or that of the position of Kurdistan. This example shows how we have found that the population is best protected by forces that reflect their makeup where possible, which is why the United States, from top to bottom, is made up of people from almost every walk of life in the United States, every color, creed, background, religion, and gender. And most importantly, all have the opportunity to succeed and excel based upon their own merit. The United States Army's recent experience in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated challenges in initially understanding the culture, political and social complexities in the operational environment. At the onset, we may not have had the language and the cultural background to engage local populations beyond providing basic needs such as food, water, sanitation, and health care. But this could be said that the slow and early on distribution of immediate aid was affected by our inability to do that, but also makes it difficult to develop durable solutions that are acceptable and sustainable by the local population. Understanding is key, and the Army benefited from the expertise provided by other government agencies, other countries, as well as other academic and civilian experts. Our efforts to build the capacity of the government and civil authorities has not been perfect in Iraq and Afghanistan. We learned many lessons along the way and understand firsthand the hardships that accompany these lessons. While during military engagements, there are jobs that only soldiers can do. However, it is not a justification for prolonged military action. It is important to hand responsibility over to civilian authorities as soon as possible. Otherwise, the military's mission can become confused, and the civilian populations who may begin to resent and chafe at the military's presence. Prolonged military occupations are rarely successful and often breed the very conditions of conflict and resentment that led to the initial confrontations. Before closing, I want to make one last overarching point that encapsulates the themes discussed here today and the critical importance of imbuing military culture with respect for human rights and international law. We see these in the Sri Lankan Army as acting with these principles and obligations is a core element of the military profession and is the core element of international legitimacy. Failure to do so can compromise a military's reputation and effectiveness that may prevent, in the long term, a durable reconciliation from taking hold. This means that if a military conducts itself outside these principles and obligations, there has to be a meaningful process for having its conduct examined and for holding those who commit aggressions or transgressions accountable. Professor Ari spoke of this yesterday. As the U.S. Army has seen firsthand through our engagement in the past decade, accountability isn't just a way of meeting international obligations. It helps build public trust in the military and ultimately makes the military and civilian components of government more effective at maintaining a durable peace and security. This is why the United States ensures these principles are embedded not only in our own military ethos, but in the cooperative engagement we have throughout the Asia-Pacific. First and foremost, the United States holds its own military to the highest ethical and legal standards. Throughout history, we have endeavored to hold ourselves accountable, to apply lessons and examples learned, to continuously improve in our relationships with ourselves, others, the American civil society, foreign populations, governments, and militaries. And we expect nothing less from our friends, allies, and partners. Taking the advice and a cue from Honorable Professor Rajiv Rajasinghe, I'll avoid speech fatigue, and I will close by saying I would like to thank the Ministry of Defense once again, the Sri Lankan Army, for taking great care of the American delegation who have attended this week. It has truly been an honor to speak to you today, and I will take your questions at lunch. But the bottom line is I thank you for your attention today, and again, it's been a distinct honor to speak with you. Thank you very much.